Hello, my name's Stewart Desson, and this short video is going to give you an overview of my PhD. It's entitled The Development of an Integrated Adaptive and Maladaptive Personality Model for Measuring the Big Five, and it's resulted in the creation of a research instrument called the BF57. That's the Big Five 57 because there's 57 items or questions in the research tool. So to cut to the chase, what are the three main achievements of the PhD? Well, the first one, a practical method of reducing evaluative bias in personality measurement has been established. And this can help user validity as set out by McClaver, Anderson, Costa, and Evers. It also, by reducing evaluative bias, helps value diversity in the workplace. So reducing evaluative bias means that we measure both ends of a scale in a way that is equally valued. For example, extroversion and introversion measured in a way that values both. The second achievement from the PhD is around measuring adaptive and maladaptive personality within one instrument without the need to pathologize or make any reference to mental health models. And in so doing, using the periodic table of personality traits, a new element of personality has been established that's not been researched or has been under-researched by others in the past. And that the third achievement is to do all of this in the context of the scientific understanding of performance at work and its relationship with personality. So the PhD looked extensively at people's performance at work as measured through rater feedback and correlated that with measures of personality with evaluative bias reduced and adaptive and maladaptive elements of personality measured. So in terms of this video, what's the structure? Well, I've covered the three main achievements. I'm going to explain why I believe this research is of interest. I'll talk about the aims and the research questions. After the research questions comes a large number of hypotheses to test. I'll go through the highlights of the work, give you the key findings. There are limitations to the PhD, and there are some pretty key suggestions for further research. I'll draw it all together in a conclusion at the end. So why is this research of interest? How is it contributing to science? Well, this research has established there is clearly evaluative bias in other research instruments, including ones that are used for key academic research. And there is a need to have a look at dysfunctional behaviours at work, and there is definitely a need to do that without making reference to mental health models. So all of these things combined can give us greater fidelity in measuring personality. It's a more detailed level, but different to how other instruments have done that before, which can help us with our criterion and predictive validity. Now this helps with organizational psychology. It's a contribution to leaders better understanding who they are and helping staff therefore be more connected and engaged to their leaders. And as it generally helps people look at their interpersonal relationships in an organizational context. So a couple of good developmental reasons why this research is of interest. And of course this research is timely because there is now an increasing interest in valuing diversity in organizations. And this is sometimes been called a deep diversity. So gender and ethnicity, while these issues have not been anywhere near fully addressed in organizations, they are known issues and we are working on it. But deep diversity, which is a difference in our way of being or in our personality, that's something that is topical and relevant to organizations. And this PhD addresses that head on. So here is Jupiter as first pictured. And there's a parallel here between how we see planets and personality. In the old days, going back a couple of decades, the view of personality was that it's pretty static. It won't change throughout your life. You have one measure and so on. But of course, if we get close to Jupiter with more technology, we can see there's a dynamic. It's not a static picture, there's movement. And so too with our personality. We may be adaptive in one context, more maladaptive in another. And things may be very, very situational, dependent on the context. And of course, the old idea that you have a fixed personality in any sort of noise in the data is in fact just measurement error, turns out to be not a good assumption. What we previously called noise is in fact the dynamic within our personality as we enter into different relationships and into different contexts. So there are 5 research aims, there's 9 research questions. So if I just highlight these research aims, the PhD set out to measure both polarities of each of the big 5 dimensions. So that's measuring them as independent opposites. This helps explore the issue of evaluative bias as outlined by Backstrom and others in 2014. Measuring adaptive and maladaptive scales is also something that's key. This has been done by others such as Hogan and Hogan through the dark side or the HDS instrument. So here we're looking at, can we measure it but as an overextension of the big 5 rather than referring a fundamental different model. So one of the research aims, the third one, was to see if we can measure both ends and if we can do it adaptively and maladaptively, is this actually useful? Does it actually reduce evaluative bias? Can we quantify that? And can we understand the convergent and the divergent validity properties of this new research instrument? And importantly, can we locate the scales? So there's 18 scales created in the BF57. Can we locate them in the periodic table of personality traits as laid out by Woods and Anderson in 2016. So the fourth aim was to see, actually, do we have good criterion validity? What can we learn from the criterion validity? Could it be that actually we get better criterion validity from one end of the polarity rather than on the other? Or could it be that the maladaptive form damages the criterion validity more than the adaptive form contributes to it, and so on? So lots of hypotheses and exploration of the impact of this model on criterion validity. And finally, this research has aimed to explore the bandwidth fidelity debate. That is it best to measure the big 5 at the level of the 5 at the high level, or is it good to take things down to a lower level, as indeed the BF57 does with the 18 scales within it? So those are the research aims. There are a number of questions that went with that and a further number of hypotheses that were tested around it. So, why measure both ends? Well, as Bruce Grossman said all the way back in the 60s, if you stick your head in the oven and your feet in the freezer, on average you'll be comfortable. And there's a direct parallel here with the big 5. So, for example, when I take the NEO instrument, I come out on agreeableness somewhere in the middle. But when I look at the results with the BF57, we find I'm actually strongly agreeable and very strongly disagreeable. And to an extent, it depends on the context and the mode. There's a degree of my free will comes into that expression, and some of it is less conscious and more how I'm wired. So an instrument that lets you look at not just the average, but an independent measure of both ends could be extremely interesting. And that's something the PhD explores. So a few words on the methodology. The 5 aims are there, the 9 research questions. There are actually 42 hypotheses that have been tested. And during the course of the PhD, I gave 6 professional talks that were peer-reviewed to give the talk in the first place at a number of conferences around the world, British Psychological Society, DOP conferences, EWOP conferences, International Test Commission conferences, and so on. And these were extremely helpful in terms of getting feedback, challenging feedback, and having some of the ideas stress tested during the course of writing and creating the PhD dissertation. In terms of some of the highlights of the work, here's some humour. Extroverts are energized by interacting with others. Introverts, well, they run away from extroverts. It's funny. However, the joke is arguably to an extent on people who are more introverted. And what we notice is that often humour is used to express our biases. And this is an example of evaluative bias in humour, where one end of a scale is measured or treated, not measured in this case, but actually just described in a way that's slightly more favourable than the other. Now that happens with humour. and we have unconscious biases that come through our humour, but do we really want that to be the case when it comes to psychometric measurement? I'm suggesting not, and this research is exploring that. So why do we have evaluative bias in psychometrics? Well, one reason, if we select items based on factor analysis, if that's the driving force for choosing the items from the item pool, there is a risk that we will build in some evaluative bias. And this is from Peterson et al. Back in 2014, when an evaluatively unbalanced set of descriptors, such as the big 5 adjectival markers, that's based on Goldberg's markers, is subjected to a simple rotation algorithm. The resulting factors almost invariably end up contrasting positive and negative descriptors. So there's something in factor analysis that doesn't discriminate between, are we really measuring a particular scale, or is it evaluative bias? The statistics don't care. They just want to come up with a good factor analysis. So what does that mean? Well, here are the trait descriptive adjectives. And there's 100 adjectives in the instrument, and there's 10 for introversion and 10 for extroversion. Here are the extroverted ones. Unrestrained, energetic, active, daring, bold, verbal. Arguably, these are things that we would relate to positively. And here are the things that describe introversion: inhibited, untalkative, timid, reserved. So in the PhD, this has been quantified. How do people relate to these adjectives? Do they see them as desirable? And how do they feel about them emotionally? And it turns out there is quite a strong evaluative bias in the selection of these adjectives. And of course, the adjectives were largely selected based on factor analysis and reliability considerations. Back in 1967, Peabody identified evaluative bias as an issue. So it's not really a new issue, and it has been researched by many of the top names in psychometrics. However, it's not really been acted on in terms of shaping the development of psychometrics. So Backstrom and his colleagues have done a lot of research on this to highlight evaluative bias as an issue, and recently spoke at the EWOP conference directly about this. There are some negative impacts of evaluative bias. One is on user validity, which means it may well be the case that as a user interpreting a report, I may not have such a good experience if I'm quite introverted and I'm low on conscientiousness, and maybe if I'm low on emotional stability. Typically the items that measure those things are not as desirable, and any report I get out may not be as favourable. And often you will find that that has an impact, and people do not always enjoy interpretations if those are their scores. And it's not necessary to always frame those things in a more negative way than the opposite polarity. And the second impact is on construct validity, because if we do measure, let's say, conscientiousness in a very positive way, you're organised, focused, and low conscientiousness, you're a slacker, you're unfocused, you're disorganised. Arguably, are we really measuring the construct fully? It could be argued that low conscientiousness has some positive aspects. Seizing the moment, being spontaneous, breaking the rules. In certain contexts, these things can be helpful, but if we don't measure it, I'm suggesting we're not measuring the construct fully, and that's a construct validity issue. So let's take a look at the big 5 here. Here's the ocean model. So on the left-hand side here, we can see the traditional measures: openness, conscientiousness, and so on. And what you can see here in terms of creating the BF57, the item pool was stratified, so we didn't end up with what was often by Cattell called the bloated specific, of just measuring extroversion purely in one way or according to one facet to increase the factor analysis and to give seemingly better numbers, but actually to measure it in too narrow a way. So to avoid that risk, there was a stratification in the BF57 to get a good spread of the different facets and traits underneath the different big 5 scales. But interestingly also, the other end of the scale has been measured as well, and in a positive, constructive or adaptive way. And of course, in order to remove evaluative bias using Peabody's methodology, to measure both ends maladaptively as well. Now, it's worth commenting that in this research, the adaptive and maladaptive design was done for 4 of the big 5, but not for the 5th one. So when undertaking this research, initially it seemed tricky to try and find adaptive ways of describing neuroticism and maladaptive ways of describing emotional stability. And that, in fact, is one of the suggestions for further research, because as it transpires, that may well be possible, and that's a rich avenue to explore going forward. Let's take a practical example. Here's extroversion. I make new friends easily. That's measured in a way that is considered neutral or positive. Here's introversion. Sometimes I listen too much. I don't give my view. This is slightly negative, neutral to slightly negative. And this is a typical structure in a Big 5 model. What this research in the BF57 does is say, actually, that's adaptive extroversion and maladaptive introversion. But using Peabody's methodology, let's balance it. Let's measure introversion adaptively. I choose my words carefully before I speak. That's arguably a helpful thing in many contexts. And let's measure extroversion maladaptively. Sometimes I talk too much. And now this is the core methodology for reducing some of the bias, partly because things will equal out when you measure 4 things instead of 1. So one way of looking at this is in terms of a compass. Instead of just getting sort of one reading of north, we've got all 4 points of the compass and a good reading on all of them. And by aggregating the scores, we reduce any bias that could be there if you just measure one of the 4. And of course, this also supports user validity in that it allows for a richer interpretation of the data and more interesting dialogue when people are trying to explore who they are. So for example, it may be helpful to know that I express my extroversion very strongly, but it can be quite maladaptive. Maybe my introversion is lower, but I tend to not do it maladaptively, and so on. There can be many ways of exploring this data that can be helpful in a developmental context. The PhD did look at the reliability and the validity of the BF57. So Cronbach alphas featured strongly, as did test-retest. Other aspects of validity, construct validity was looked at through factor analysis. That was key. Convergent, divergent validity with a range of instruments, including a number of the best research instruments on the market, such as Hogan's instruments and the IPIP Neo, the trait descriptive adjectives, and so on. Criterion validity was looked at in terms of gathering rate of feedback on how people are seen at work, and the model used for that was the Great 8 competency model, another excellent, well-researched and validated model. Consensual validity was examined, so I may see myself as extroverted, but how do others see me? The user validity was examined, and quantifying the reduction in evaluative bias was also undertaken, and I'm pleased to say a fairly significant reduction in evaluative bias has been reported, and that's one of the key findings. So just to touch on a few of the methods used, but by no means all of them, here's a factor analysis, a confirmatory factor analysis. So having explored the structure of the data and established the Big 5 is present, a model to describe how all the different 18 scales of the BF57 interact was produced, and the confirmatory factor analysis supported the structure of the data, and here you have the final outcome from it. It is interesting to note that given the sample size was good, in excess of 2,500 people completed the instrument for the research for looking at the confirmatory factor analysis, that enabled a really good and rigorous level of testing of the structure. An alternative view that it's just the Big 5 and it's a simple Big 5 structure and things don't relate to each other, that was pretty clearly rejected through confirmatory factor analysis, which of course was in line with expectations. Here are some of the numbers from the confirmatory factor analysis, just to give you a sense for what's behind that rather complex diagram, and you can clearly see some strong cross-loadings while still fundamentally being basically a Big 5 model. I'd like to say a few words about the periodic table, which is strongly advocated by Woods and Anderson in their seminal 2016 paper. And what their approach does, building on many giants that have gone before, is to adopt a circumplex approach where each of the big 5 dimensions are mapped against another one. So here's an example looking at openness versus agreeableness. And the interaction of these 2 dimensions is located in the periodic table. And by comparing all the dimensions, these are the different combinations that are produced. And the idea here is, instead of trying to say, well, the big 5 are really 5 independent factors, let's explore how we measure with items the space in between the factors and the things that the traits that may be combinations of the different factors. And their table highlighted, interestingly, that in many of the big instruments, some combinations are not measured at all. And what's intriguing in the BF57 is that some of the less commonly researched combinations in the periodic table are picked up in the BF57 as a result of this methodology to reduce bias and measure adaptive and maladaptive. In particular, looking at conscientiousness measured maladaptively, that's something that is measured that in the periodic table comes out as conscientiousness first, blended with some neuroticism, and that's a really interesting finding that certainly merits further studies to see if it can be replicated and looked at in more detail. If we now go to the Great 8, which is a competency model developed by Bartram in a seminal paper in 2005, and also Kurz and Bartram in 2002 and so on. We've taken that model and in collaboration with Dr. Kurz have identified 8 marker items to measure the Great 8. So that's what you can see on the horizontal here. And on the vertical are the 18 scales in the BF57. And 254 people sought feedback on their performance at work. And this is the resulting correlation matrix to give us some interesting criterion validity. If we take out the less significant statistics, this hones our attention. Now, there were 14 hypotheses made before the analysis was undertaken, and it turned out that 12 of them were supported by the data and 2 weren't. And those hypotheses were largely based on looking at the work of Kurz and also Kurz and Bartram's seminal 2005 paper. So I've highlighted here the ones that came out aligned with the previous research. So we can see that creating concepts does indeed correlate with openness, as we might expect, and relating to people is indeed linked to extroversion, and we can see respecting people has got some nice links to agreeableness. Adapting to demands is indeed supported by being high on emotional stability and low on neuroticism. And then we've got the delivering results, which partially conformed with the hypothesis, so degree of conscientiousness coming through there, as did driving performance. And the sum of the Great 8, as a measure of performance overall, adding them all up, did conform with some of what we were expecting. Indeed, conscientiousness was coming through as important as was emotional stability to overall performance. There were some surprises though. So the ones that didn't work, we were expecting, analysing situations to link to openness. It didn't particularly. In fact, it linked to disagreeableness. That was an interesting finding. And controlling resources, which we thought would come through more related to extroversion, according to previous research, seem to have more of a link around the agreeableness, disagreeableness, and emotional stability elements. And then if we look at some extra sort of bonus findings, it did seem that a few things such as delivering results were linked to sort of low openness. So in other words, you're more likely to deliver results if you're sensible, practical, don't get carried away with good ideas. And driving performance was another interesting unexpected correlation. And the ones that didn't work, well, there are some red blocks here. It's the openness not linking to analysing, and it's the extroversion not linking to controlling. Those are both interesting things that were not confirmed. Some other hypotheses were tested around evaluative bias. So it was hypothesized that across openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness, that the act of measuring both ends and measuring adaptively and maladaptively, that would reduce the evaluative bias compared with the neo-IPIP and compared with the TDA. And indeed, there was a good reduction in the evaluative bias. Hasn't removed it altogether, but a pretty large reduction. So I'd like to walk through the 9 research questions that were explored in the PhD. The first was, is the proposed BF57 model of personality, is it compatible with the Big Five structure? And the straight answer to this is yes. Of course, there's nuances and it can be explored in more depth in the full write-up, but the gist of it is the confirmatory factor analysis shows that even when we measure both ends, adaptively, maladaptively, we still fundamentally have the Big Five structure at work. The 18 scales created were explored. So the second research question, where do those 18 scales sit in Wood's and Anderson's periodic table approach? That's been identified, and indeed one of the 18 is located in a less researched area of the periodic table. The third research question, do the BF57 adaptive traits correlate more than the maladaptive traits with other sort of bright side measures of the Big Five, such as the HPI, Hogan instrument, the NEO, the TDA, and so on? And the basic answer is yes, the adaptive scales do seem to, there's good evidence that they seem to correlate more than the maladaptive ones with those other instruments. Conversely, do the maladaptive scales in the BF57 correlate more highly with the Hogan dark side, the HDS, which we might have hypothesized? The answer is somewhat more mixed here. That is the case when we look at introversion and when we look at neuroticism. So that was the case there. But when we look at the more extroverted, openness, conscientiousness qualities, those hypotheses were not supported. And that certainly merits further research and investigation. Is there evidence to support conceptualizing the BF57 as overplayed? We believe so. So there's evidence here that actually it can be helpful to look at maladaptive as indeed simply an overplayed form of the more adaptive traits. And indeed that brings into question as to whether the term maladaptive is a helpful term. Probably is not when it comes to practical applications in organizations. Maybe terms that are more easy for people to grasp, such as overplaying or overextending, could be more helpful than maladaptive. So how well has the BF57 conformed with a priori hypotheses regarding the relationship with the Grade 8 competencies? Well, as you've seen, generally pretty well. 12 out of 14 of the key hypotheses were confirmed, and there were other hypotheses that were explored too. And generally the methodology of having a priori hypotheses and making point-to-point measures from specific Big Five dimensions to specific competencies is seen as a best practice as advocated by Bartram and others. So is there a differential criterion validity pattern when we break things out into both ends and adaptive, maladaptive? And the answer is yes. There's good evidence for that. That, in other words, instead of just measuring, let's say, extroversion, by breaking it into extroversion, introversion, adaptive, maladaptive, we do find some interesting and different criterion validity patterns that are quite significantly different. So if we compare the BF57 approach, does it shed any light on the bandwidth fidelity debate? Well, the analysis here suggests we do explain more of the variance when we drop it down to the level of the 18 scales and look at things with higher fidelity. And the bottom line, can this approach, when we wrap it all together, measuring both ends, adaptive, maladaptive, can it actually reduce evaluative bias? And the answer basically is yes, it can. So those really are the key findings. There are some limitations to this research I'd like to share with you and some suggestions for more research. So this is what's called a weird sample. It's Western, educated people, industrialized, rich, democratic. So a lot of the research was on people from the UK, Canada, the US, and so on. And of course, that means we cannot generalize the conclusions to other cultures around the world. And indeed, we need to do further research, even within the West, on different samples to revalidate it. So, second limitation, our criterion measures were primarily rater feedback and 360 observation from others. That happens to be a very, very good way of doing it. It has a degree of objectivity because other people are assessing it, but there are other measures that could be explored as well, and that would be useful for further research. Of course, even when we have these interesting correlations, and even when our a priori hypotheses are confirmed, as they were with the great 8 12 out of 14 times, we still can't assume a causal inference just because two things correlate. More research is required to understand why they correlate. The confirmatory factor analysis, which was a very, very interesting piece of analysis, that clearly needs to be replicated on another large sample size and partly explore the statistical technique and the assumptions required to do that, and partly to try and find out if the structure does indeed hold with the BF57. It's also interesting to consider, and this could be great for further research, could it be that what we call maladaptive traits, which could be detrimental to performance in certain contexts, actually may help our performance in other contexts? So, for example, if a soldier's about to go into combat, it could be that high levels of maladaptive disagreeableness are helpful, maybe. Although one could argue as well, you need agreeableness and collaboration with colleagues too, and so on. Could it be that even neuroticism might be helpful in certain high-risk situations where you need to keep yourself safe? Could neuroticism be adaptive? We think it could. What about the opposite, emotional stability, normally seen as a sort of the crown jewels of traits to have for performance at work? But could it be, in certain contexts, too much emotional stability in its maladaptive form could be a bad thing? Could somebody become too optimistic or overconfident? Clearly this is possible, and it requires further research. Indeed, just as we have the periodic table, could we have it for maladaptive traits? Could there be a periodic table of maladaptive traits? That would be a really, really interesting idea, and applying the Woods and Anderson methodologies and the interaction and the additional circumplexes, that could be a good thing to do. Could indeed the BF57 be used to help validate other instruments for dissecting and assessing what are the instruments actually measuring? So because we have the adaptive, maladaptive both ends, instruments that have been around for a while, it may be interesting to explore what they may be measuring through this particular lens, and that's something that doesn't seem to have been done before. So the BF57 could be a great complement to the periodic table. So in summary, there were 5 key conclusions from the PhD. The first one, evaluative bias does exist, and it is an issue. And the second conclusion is that we can partly address this issue if we measure both ends of the big 5. That's the first practical thing that we can do to address it. Then we can look at adaptive and maladaptive, so too much of a good thing maladaptively, and we find if we combine those things together, that also helps with the reduction of evaluative bias. We also know that we can now express maladaptive behaviours as too much of a good thing, which can increase user validity and have a positive impact on interpretation. Wrapping the first 3 points together, yes, we can reduce evaluative bias with this approach, at least in this research compared to the TDA and the IPIT-NEO. And I would suspect with other instruments, although that's yet to be proved and the evidence gathered. From a user validity point of view, measuring both ends, adaptively and maladaptively, allows a much richer interpretation of the data to explore how people may be different in different contexts. So instead of assuming we're just one thing, we can explore greater nuances. And finally, the 5th conclusion is we have found some measures of an element of the periodic table that has been under-researched by many of the other models available for research, at least as identified by Woods and Anderson in their 2016 paper. That requires further examination, but it's a really interesting and great conclusion. So I hope you found this video helpful. It is a canter through many, many years of research in the dissertation, Of course, if anybody would like a full copy of the dissertation, I would be delighted to provide that for you. And if anybody is interested to hear more, I'd be very, very happy to put on a webinar for those keener to dig into the statistics and ask any challenging questions that you may wish to ask. So, thank you so much for your time listening to this video, and I wish you well. Thank you.